Hello friends, and welcome to my channel. My name is Haley and I am a Christian wife, mama of 3, homeschooler, and avid reader. And the last part is what today is about. If you watched my literary life plan for 2024, you know that I chose a male author of the year, a female author of the year, a poet of the year, and 1 reading challenge to complete. And in this video, we are going to talk about our male author of the year, which is C.S. Lewis. So I'm going to update you on all of the books I've read so far and what's up next on my C.S. Lewis TBR. We're going to start with Mere Christianity. This is C.S. Lewis's take on the Christian faith. So in the very beginning of it, he kind of breaks down why there is a God of the universe and then why that God is the God of Christianity. He then goes on to break down the Christian faith and some of the main parts of it, things that all Christians believe. What I really liked about Mere Christianity was that it wasn't at all legalistic when it came to the main components of the Christian faith. It also did not prescribe to any one denominational beliefs. These are beliefs we kind of can all agree on, whether you're evangelical, Catholic, Protestant, any denomination within those realms. This is the core of what we believe. And I enjoyed reading it as a Christian because I think it really helps with apologetics. So if you have a really hard time explaining to someone else, for example, the Trinity or how God lives outside of time and is eternal, C.S. Lewis does such a great job of breaking those down with analogies and metaphors that make it easy for the common man to understand. I would say that this is Mere Christianity, or Christianity simply put. I think it would be really amazing for someone who is a non-Christian to read this book. I would love to hear what their thoughts would be on it right after reading. But if you are a Christian and you just want to know how to explain your faith better to someone else, I would highly recommend picking this up. And it's also C.S. Lewis's one of his most famous works. So if you wanted to start anywhere with C.S. Lewis, I would start here just to join the conversation. But I will share some commonplace quotes that I wrote down from Mere Christianity, and some of these you will probably recognize. Anyone who is honestly trying to be a Christian will soon find his intelligence being sharpened. One of the reasons why it needs no special education to be a Christian is that Christianity is an education itself. That could be not more true as a Christian. I have learned so much more just by seeing the world through a Christian lens, and it is what led me to an education for my kids in homeschooling, which is Charlotte Mason, if you were curious, that I believe fits within that Christian perspective and just who we are as people. So I love that quote. And then another one: faith is the art of holding on to things your reason has once accepted in spite of your changing moods. How true is that? Often as Christians, we may be angry at God. We may not like what He is or isn't doing in our life, but at the end of the day, He's God, whether we like it or not, whether we agree with it or not. And faith is just acknowledging that no matter what your mood is. And there's a lot more in here, but I'm not going to spoil the book or anything like that by sharing more. But that's the first C.S. Lewis I completed this year. And the second C.S. Lewis book I read was the Screwtape Letters. So if Mere Christianity is one of his most popular nonfiction works, the Screwtape Letters is probably his second. And this was incredibly well done and original. I just love the idea that he took the Christian perspective and flipped it. So in the Screwtape Letters, Screwtape, who is a head demon, a head tempter, is writing letters to his nephew, Wormwood, who is a new tempter, a young tempter, and has been assigned a patient, or a person, to tempt away from Christianity. And this is Screwtape's advice to Wormwood on exactly how to do that. And it's so funny because of the perspective, because Jesus, who is our truth and our everything, is Screwtape's enemy. You know, as Christians, we often refer to Satan as the enemy. The enemy, what is the enemy doing in our life? Well, Screwtape refers to Jesus that way, and it's really interesting to see how the patient or the human is sometimes saved by Jesus through temptations. And something else I really, really liked about this book was all of the subtle things that we don't realize are sin or are temptations that we can often be tempted with. And one such example I can think of is gluttony. So he said, for an example of gluttony, it's not just consuming everything, but it could be in the particular taste or delicacy of what you consume. And you can think of someone who is just always putting everybody out when it comes to their food. They're constantly sending food back to a restaurant or just having to have things exactly their way and putting everyone else out. And it's a lot of things like that you don't really think about that as being just a strict sin, but it can eventually lead you to a path into sin and away from God. And I love the ending of this book. I will not spoil it, but it was so worth it to see the Christian's journey through the tempter's eyes, and then Screwtape's reactions to his nephew, which sometimes are just in a rage because he thinks his nephew's an imbecile and he's very proud of himself. But if you read this book, please make it to the ending because it was totally worth it. And I'm going to share a couple of commonplace quotes from here. The first one is, "Indeed, the safest road to hell is the gradual one, the gentle slope, the soft underfoot, without sudden turnings, without milestones, without signposts." And that's true. What can often lead us away from Christ is all of these little subtle things that we don't really think about or don't realize until it's too late. And then another one that I really loved was, "It is most important thus to cut every generation off from all others, for where learning makes a free commerce between the ages, there is always the danger that the characteristic errors of one may be convicted by the characteristic truths of another." And this is why we read old books, because often older generations have already figured some things out. And if a tempter can cut us off from that truth and that knowledge and that wisdom that could help us in this time, we may find ourselves stuck in a horrible situation. And so that was another quote that I commonplaced. And there are several. I'm just sharing my favorites because otherwise, I'd just be reading you C.S. Lewis's book, because all of his books can just fit right into your commonplace book. But the next one I read was The Magician's Nephew by C.S. Lewis, of course. And this is the first book in the Chronicles of Narnia series, if you go by chronological order, right here, because this is the Genesis story of Narnia and how it was created. But it is I want to say the fourth or the fifth if you go in publication order, which is what I'm doing. I started the Chronicles of Narnia at the end of last year, loved them, and that's why I chose C.S. Lewis as my author of the year for this year. But I finally made it to The Magician's Nephew, and this is one of my favorites. I actually would say that my favorite C.S. Lewis Chronicles of Narnia book so far is The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. But this one comes in second place for me. I have absolutely loved it because of the main characters. Diggory, who we find out later is the professor in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, and Polly, just their friendship. He is so like us. He's very chivalrous and kind of wants to do the right thing and feels the urge to do the right thing. And yet, he's just tempted to do wrong, and that is so human. And I saw so many parallels between the Garden of Eden and Narnia at this point in time, and the way that Aslan sings Narnia into creation was beautiful. This book was absolutely gorgeously written. And there's another book that I'm going to talk about, not written by C.S. Lewis, but about C.S. Lewis, that really opened my eyes to his writing, particularly in this book. But we'll get to that at the end of the video. But I think my favorite scene in this book was the wood between the worlds. It was just so immersive and magical and enchanting. And there was a point where I stopped reading the book and I got in the truck with my husband. We were going on a ride with the kids, and I said to him, "I'm sorry, you'll have to excuse me for a minute because I feel a little bit disoriented from reading the Narnia book. I'm just still there. It was so good, so well written, so transportive that I just had a hard time snapping back to reality, which very much speaks to C.S. Lewis and his writing style. So The Magician's Nephew and The Chronicles of Narnia, probably one of my favorites so far. And the next book I read by C.S. Lewis was An Experiment in Criticism. And if you are a reader or consider yourself a reader, then you absolutely must read this book, because C.S. Lewis talks about what makes a good book, what makes a good reader. And then he sort of addresses literary critics who don't really love literature and who may not necessarily be good readers, they just are good critics, which is not what the point is. And I listen to the Literary Life podcast episodes that pair with An Experiment in Criticism, and that really just enhanced the reading experience for me, just having somebody to walk you through it who maybe knows some of the references and just honestly somebody to talk books with. But this was one of my favorites. So if you are a reader and you want to start with C.S. Lewis, this would be one of the first ones that I would recommend. I would tell you to read Mere Christianity, The Screwtape Letters, The Chronicles of Narnia, and An Experiment in Criticism if you read nothing else by C.S. Lewis. And this one had a lot of quotes that you hear on C.S. Lewis where he talks about reading and books. And so I'll share a few that I wrote down in my own commonplace book from this one. Those who read Elmer Fudd. Those who read great works, on the other hand, will read the same work 10, 20, or 30 times during the course of their life. This one spoke to me because I am such a gluttonous reader in the fact that I just want to read more, read new. And C.S. Lewis actually talked about that being a bad thing in some ways, that if you really love a book, you're going to come back to it again and again and again and get a little more and get a little more and get a little more. And so that inspired me to reread Jane Eyre, which I had only read once, and I declared it as my favorite book. And I thought, it's my favorite book, but I've only ever read it once. What kind of a reader am I to say such a thing? So I read it again this year, and I'm so glad that I did, and I know that I will read it again. So that was a really convicting point he made about reading in literature. Another commonplace quote for An Experiment in Criticism that I wrote down was, thirdly, the first reading of some literary work is often, to the literary, an experience so momentous that only experiences of love, religion, or bereavement can furnish a standard of comparison. And that is so true. When you read a book for the very first time, you are just enraptured and engrossed. And even if you come back to read a second, third, or 30th time, nothing compares to that first time where everything is new, the characters, the world, the writer maybe. And I loved that quote. And there were so many others that, like I said, I would just read you the whole book if I were to commonplace everything by C.S. Lewis, because it's that good. So if you consider yourself a reader, I would highly recommend An Experiment in Criticism. And so those are all of the physical books that I read by C.S. Lewis so far this year, but I've listened to 2 audiobooks. The first one is a Preface to Paradise Lost, which is written by C.S. Lewis. And I am currently reading Paradise Lost by John Milton, which is an epic poem, and it's a retelling of the story of Adam and Eve in the garden, and Satan's tempting them for the first time, but it's an epic poetry form. So it can be really difficult to read if you're not used to that. So I read A Preface to Paradise Lost by C.S. Lewis to learn a little bit more about it and to kind of have a good heads up before diving in, and I am so glad I did, because at the beginning of that book, he actually breaks down epic poetry, what it is, why did John Milton write in this form, what inspired him. And so I learned a lot not only about Paradise Lost, but about some of those epic poems like the Odyssey, the Iliad, Beowulf, and all of that. And then after that, he kind of goes and breaks down some of the characters and the theology and ideas behind them. And Paradise Lost is not perfect theology. It's a story. It's a retelling told in poetry form. And John Milton really takes a little bit of fictional liberty there. And so there's a lot of literary criticism about Paradise Lost just because of its theology and not for its writing. And C.S. Lewis really goes to defend Milton. And I am so glad that I read it before diving in, because so far for Paradise Lost, I've had no trouble understanding what's happening, and I've just really been able to enjoy the story as a whole. So that's a great academic work by C.S. Lewis if you want him to kind of lecture you a little bit, because he was a professor. And so if you want him to teach you a class on Paradise Lost before diving in, I highly recommend that. And the very last book about C.S. Lewis that I've read so far this year, or I should say listened to, is The Medieval Mind of C.S. Lewis by Dr. Jason Baxter. This was so insightful to what influenced C.S. Lewis and what influenced his writing. There was a chapter particularly on why C.S. Lewis loved Dante. So if you've read The Great Divorce, that's actually inspired by the Divine Comedy. And he also went to talk about some of his other... I have to open some Play-Doh. Just give me just a second. I can't. Here you go.
Mommy can't open.
Yeah. I didn't get all of the Play-Doh out. All right, there you go. Take your cup. You're welcome. It also talked about the voices that really inspired C.S. Lewis. So Boethius was a voice that inspired him, and just medieval thought in general. And so Dr. Jason Baxter really went into depth on what that is and how that influenced C.S. Lewis's writing. So he did something that I really liked, and that is explain the medieval thought and then kind of showed where that popped up in C.S. Lewis's books. So there was one thing he mentioned about atmosphere. C.S. Lewis loved atmosphere in books, and that's what really sold a book for him. He did not like The Three Musketeers by Dumas, I believe I'm saying that right, because it lacked atmosphere. It was all action and no atmosphere. And when I was reading The Magician's Nephew and I was in the wood between the worlds, I totally get it, because when you're reading his fictional works, C.S. Lewis nails the atmosphere. He will talk about how the air feels, and he just completely dives you in using all of the senses. And that was a very medieval thought. And also in The Magician's Nephew, the idea of Aslan singing Narnia into perfect harmony. The medievals believed the universe was created in harmony. It actually kind of has this harmonious sound that all blends and holds it together. And so that pops up in C.S. Lewis's writings too. And overall, it was just very insightful to kind of dive into who he was, why he believed what he believed, why he wrote the way he did, and then what works you can see some of those ideas pop up in. And so that's all that I've read from C.S. Lewis so far, but next up on my TBR, or what I've already started, is The Abolition of Man by C.S. Lewis, a defense of universal values. I'm really excited about this one because I think this one is going to give me some real clarity in homeschool. Like I said, we're homeschooling in a Charlotte Mason way, and Charlotte Mason really focuses, if you've heard anything about Charlotte Mason, you'll hear truth, goodness, and beauty. Truth, goodness, and beauty. And that's true, and virtue is incredibly important in that. So I'm excited to get into this one. I haven't gotten very far, so I don't really know much about it, but I'll just read the introduction to you. In The Abolition of Man, C.S. Lewis sets out to persuade his audience of the importance and relevance of universal values such as courage and honor in contemporary society. Both astonishing and prophetic, this book is one of the most debated of Lewis's extraordinary works. This one is really short, so I think I'll be able to fly through it pretty quickly, but I'm really excited to see some of his ideas on this, and I think this is another book I'm going to see really translate into what I've read in the Chronicles of Narnia so far, because you can tell when you're reading his fictional works what virtues he really values in his characters. This book just hearing it talk about virtue makes me think of Reepicheep, who is probably, if not my favorite character in the Chronicles of Narnia, one of them, because he is so virtuous and valiant and courageous and honorable. And I think this book is going to give me some insight into why C.S. Lewis wrote The Humble Mouse in that way. And then another book that I'm currently working my way through is The Horse and His Boy, which was supposed to come before reading The Magician's Nephew, but I think maybe the horse on the cover kind of got me a little bit crossed, and so I flip-flopped them in publication order, which is fine because the other one is sort of a prequel in the genesis of Narnia. It didn't mess up the storyline at all. These, we actually revisit the Pevensies in this one, but we see them as the kings and queens of Narnia. And if I'm being honest, this one is not one of my favorites so far. I still love it. It's still really good. By the time I finish it, I'm probably 3/4 of the way through, I will probably have given it 4 stars because the writing is so good, and C.S. Lewis's just wit and insight into the characters is really entertaining. But as far as the storyline and the plot, I'm just having a bit of a hard time with it. I can't really figure out why, but all of the other books in the Chronicles of Narnia, I finished in like 2 days, in a weekend for sure. But I've been working on this one for a while, and it could be from reader burnout. I think I'm at that point where I've just read a ton this year, and so I'm feeling the lag of that a little bit. But it's still good, and I'll know more when I finish it. But this is it, and then after that I will move on to The Silver Chair, and then the final book in the Chronicles of Narnia, The Last Battle, and I have plenty of C.S. Lewis's nonfiction works left to go. So I will continue to keep you all updated on that. My next video is going to be about my female author of the year, who is Jane Austen. I have read 3 of Jane Austen's novels so far. I have loved them, of course, and I'm really excited to talk to you about that. So please subscribe to the channel and like this video if you haven't already, and I will see you next time. Happy reading!